Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name's Emily and today we're going to be talking about a book that I just finished that I am obsessed with and that I am so excited to see the movie for. The book is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I'm going to talk a little bit about Suzanne Collins and then we're going to talk about some themes in this book and some motifs and some of the reasons that I loved it so much. There were so many things that I thought were really interesting about the book and a lot of things that Suzanne Collins kind of made subtle comments on, and I feel like that's something that she's really good about, is just writing something that is so thought-provoking that you can spiral and think about for so long. I know with The Hunger Games, there's just so many good discussions that came out of reading those books and so many different things that you can take away from them, and people take away such different things because everyone thinks about things and reads literature so differently. It was told from President Snow's perspective when he was, I think, 18, so kind of like right on the brink of adulthood, I guess. I feel like in some ways he was very much still a child. It follows his life and how he came to be who he was in the villain, and it talks about how the Hunger Games came to be as well. It wasn't as fast-paced as the Hunger Games and the characters weren't quite as compelling in some ways, but I feel like a lot of that was done intentionally and I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about it. But before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about Suzanne Collins and set the scene by reading the first paragraph of the acknowledgments in the back of the book. This video is going to contain spoilers. I think I'm going to spoil pretty much everything. So if you don't want to hear spoilers, I would definitely recommend not watching this yet. And the movie comes out on the 16th of November. It looks like it's going to be really good. And The Hunger Games did a really good job, all three of them, I feel like, with the movies. So really excited about that. But the first paragraph of the acknowledgments says, "I'd like to thank my parents for their love and for always supporting my writing, my dad for teaching me about the Enlightenment thinkers and the state of nature debate from an early age, and my mom, the English major, for nurturing the reader in me and for all those happy hours around the piano." Reading that paragraph in the acknowledgments really reinforced my idea of Suzanne Collins as this person that wrote a book with a very compelling story. You can tell that she's a really good storyteller and builds amazing characters, and also wants to call to attention some questions, some philosophical ideas, and she does an excellent job of that. And I think that that's what makes her writing so beautiful, is the bridge between a really good, really compelling, fast-paced story that you can't put down and thought-provoking social and political commentary. Just like two things that make for an incredible book, and when you put them together, it's quite literally a masterpiece. And what my theory is with this book is that Suzanne Collins wrote The Hunger Games to make a point about the government and politics and humanity, and there were a lot of parallels to America when talking about the Capitol and the way that they treat people. And I think that a lot of focus in the Hunger Games trilogy went to the love triangle and the action and the story and the characters, and it's hard for it to not go there because it's so good. But I do think that she kind of nailed the point home that she was trying to make in the Hunger Games and was a little less subtle in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes than she was in the Hunger Games. And I will say that I read The Hunger Games and Catching Fire pretty early in this year and then recently read Mockingjay, so some of my memories of The Hunger Games and Catching Fire are fading a little bit, but definitely thinking about Mockingjay and thinking about Katniss, and there were so many tie-ins and references to the original trilogy in this book, which made it really fun. It filled in a lot of where things came from. I love when an author shows that she was being so intentional with her choices and with her themes. It was just so well done. I think that something Suzanne Collins does a really good job of also is pulling a theme throughout a story. So for example, President Snow's wearing the rose. We get to see where that comes from, and we see that throughout all the books. It's always mentioned. She does things very intentionally, and you can tell because they're just woven throughout her stories in such a compelling and detailed way. I feel like Songbirds and Snakes leaned away from the very lovable character of Katniss in the Hunger Games and leaned more into a Patrick Bateman-like character where he lacks a lot of empathy. So if you like reading it from the perspective of a character that's very kind and compassionate and easy to root for, this is not that. This is very villain origin story. I thought maybe what it was gonna do was make you feel a little bad for President Snow, but it really didn't. It made me understand why he is the way he is, but it didn't justify any of his actions. And I thought that that was really cool, because I would prefer to hear how a villain came to be but not end up feeling bad for them than I would, I think, to like read the villain origin story, as we so often do, and think, oh, like we kind of feel so bad for him. He had a horrible upbringing. And in a lot of ways, he really did have a horrible upbringing, but we kind of can see through this book how a horrible upbringing doesn't have to result in a bad person. We see that through the Hunger Games, and then we see that through the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I'm rambling, but Suzanne Collins ultimately expanded on a lot of the ideas that were in the Hunger Games and drove the point home through a different perspective. Hearing the capital horror story from the perspective of a character that was very deadpan and Machiavellian really drove the point home that she was trying to make, and I really liked it. And something that I love in a book is when I read a sentence or a paragraph or a chapter or a book and I'm thinking about it for days, for weeks, for months to come, and this is definitely one of those. So now I'm going to talk about some of the things that I'm thinking about after reading this book. And these are going to be in no particular order, and it's not all inclusive either. These are just the things that stood out to me that I enjoyed, and I put them in a list, and it kept getting longer and longer the more that I thought about it and the more that I talked about it. So I'm sure that I'm going to have so many thoughts after this video, and you know, maybe we can do a part 2. The first theme that I saw throughout the Hunger Games trilogy and the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes prequel was individualism versus collectivism. We in America are such an individualistic society where we're so used to, in a lot of cases, really looking out for ourselves and focusing on ourselves first and other people second. And Snow definitely had that tendency. He wanted things to be not his problem. He wanted to deal with things in such a way that would get it off his plate, not necessarily in a way that would help someone. And I thought that that was really interesting, especially compared with Katniss, who sacrificed everything she had for her family and held no resentment over that. There were a lot of scenarios where it was really interesting for me to think about, okay, this is what Snow's doing. What would Katniss have done in this situation? Like, just his small choices, they just are such completely opposite characters. It was really interesting to see the contrast of someone that comes from a poor background and is used to being in a community and being in a collective in District 12. And then another thing that I really enjoyed in this book that kind of goes along with that, like, comparison to North America, is Snow's comment about when this was North America, there were so many capitals, what a waste of human potential, and just his kind of nod to like how much he would have loved America was a really obvious parallel, even though it kind of felt like she was breaking a fourth wall by saying that. It was interesting to hear Snow's love for the capital and just being like, I wish that there were so many more capitals, versus Katniss is very obviously anti-capital. They've ruined her life. Similar but a little different was the theme of classism and social inequality. I feel like this is one of the most obvious themes in the Hunger Games that is just, again, perfectly woven throughout. And that was in this as well, but from someone that had a better upbringing. Katniss and the people from the districts, I feel like in most cases, were very grateful for anything that they had and any help that they got. He was very much embarrassed of his family's downfall, and it was interesting to see the other side, the side that really cares a lot about appearances versus the very like realistic and less concerned with appearances Katniss. Another theme that's present in this book is lying and deception. I feel like that comes across very repeatedly, and Snow is constantly thinking like a politician and acting like a politician, even from being 18 years old. He was very good at keeping up the facade that his family had money throughout the book, and was very calculated with the way that he spoke, and we could see his thoughts and then the way that he would react to a situation. And it was very crazy to see like how much and how easily someone can lie and how much someone can put on a facade for other people. Like, he was very much aware of who he was talking to constantly, and always tailoring what he was saying to fly under the radar, seem well adjusted, like fit. He had this appearance of himself in his head, and he was constantly acting to keep up this appearance. Another big theme throughout the Hunger Games and Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes both, but I feel like especially in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was love and what it is to different people. For Katniss, love was very much sacrifice, and she always tried to settle the score and do the right thing. Lucy Gray is the tribute from District 12 that Snow is mentoring and ends up being his love interest. And for her, love was trust, and she stated this outright. And for Snow, I feel like every time he would say that he loved someone, he really didn't. Like, he was not experiencing the full capacity of what it meant to love. I don't think he was a total psychopath where he didn't feel anything. I do think that he in a lot of ways had similar traits, and I don't know that much about psychopaths and sociopaths, but he definitely suffered from a complete lack of empathy for other people. So I don't think that he really felt love, and it was very obvious, especially at the end. He does not value love or other people as much as he values power and control and landing on top. A huge theme in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was the state of nature debate. Are humans inherently good, or are humans inherently evil? Without laws and without authority, would we kill each other, or would we be so compassionate and better off? It's just the question that you could ponder forever and ever and never come to an answer on. And there's been a lot of great literature about this, and the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes definitely played into that a lot. And the people at the Capitol thought that people were inherently evil and that they had to be reminded constantly who was in control, because if they didn't remember who was in control, they would rise up and rebel. And it was really interesting thinking about how at the end of Mockingjay, the rebels from 13 wanted to potentially start a Hunger Games for the Capitol's children. That was just incredible writing, because it really makes you think, is there a right side and a wrong side when people are suffering? Another theme that I enjoyed and thought Suzanne Collins executed extremely well was the theme of power and corruption and power. And it kind of makes you think, do corrupt people seek out positions of power, or does power corrupt people? And it could be a little bit of both, honestly. There were implications that corrupt people seek out power when we talk about Snow, but when we talk about President Coin, was she corrupt to start with, or did the power corrupt her, or did she think that she was doing what she had to do? A book about President Coin and how she came to be would be extremely interesting, and I have seen some theories floating around that Coin is Lucy Gray's daughter. I don't know about all that. I feel like that's kind of a crazy conspiracy theory, but crazier things have been true, so not gonna discount it. Nature versus nurture was a big theme. The way that I was thinking about it was, if Katniss was in Snow's shoes and had the same upbringing as him, because he was so indoctrinated from such an early age to think the way that he thought, and you can see it in this book, but then you also have people that went through the same indoctrination as he did and had a bit more compassion than he did. Are bad people born bad, or do they become bad because of their circumstances? And then another thing that goes along with that is the kind of like emotional intelligence slash critical thinking versus being book smart, because Katniss didn't have a great education, but she had a lot of empathy and emotional intelligence and was able to think very critically and constantly was thinking critically from a very young age. And Snow was not a great critical thinker, and he also had horrible media comprehension skills. Obviously, a formal education is not synonymous with compassion. There's a lot to debate of, was Snow fated to become a bad person because he was made to be a monster? And we'll talk about making a monster a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. The last theme on my list is chaos and control, and the contrast between those two things. Snow's main motivation was he wanted to constantly be in control. He didn't like feeling out of control, and he would pretty much do anything and sacrifice anyone he had to remain in control. It was interesting to see, even though he fought so hard to have control, there was still so much chaos all around him, and he was never truly in control. Obviously, none of us are ever truly in control. It was very cool to watch him trying to be in control of his life versus the chaos that was playing out in the Hunger Games right in front of him, and how he kind of dealt with that and coped with his circumstances. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the smaller things. So like the things that I talked about were more overarching themes that we saw in the book. Motifs are reoccurring concepts that are used to reinforce themes, and Suzanne Collins does a great job of not only discussing the themes, reinforcing those themes. The first motif was music, and I loved in the Hunger Games, like the Hunger Games soundtrack is so good. The ballads, like the songs that Katniss sings to Rue and the song that she sings about the hanging tree are written so haunting, and we got to see where those came from in this book, and it brought a whole different meaning to that music, which was so cool. And it was also really interesting to hear about how Snow didn't like music and had pretty bad media literacy, I would say, around music. He didn't really understand what the heck people were talking about in something very poetic, where Lucy Gray, his love interest, was a musician and a singer. I think that kind of goes back to education versus emotional intelligence and critical thinking, because he's so well educated but still is not comprehending things that people that have less of an education than him are easily able to comprehend and pick up. Snow really takes things at face value, and I think that that is something that makes him a really good villain and a really good, cold-hearted, calculated villain. There were a ton of comparisons to animals when talking about the people from the districts. This was like the biggest thing that I noticed, especially towards the beginning of the book. There were literally so many times that there was just a comparison made to animals. The people from the districts, when they got hurt, they talked about, oh, the veterinarian will help them. And it was just like mind-blowing to read them comparing them to animals. The people from the capital literally do not see these people as human beings. They literally see them as animals, and that's insane. And Suzanne Collins did a great job of like weaving that theme throughout the entire book. We can definitely see the theme of classism and social inequality in the animal comparisons very, very clearly. It really drove that point home. It's really sad that Snow was indoctrinated his whole life to believe that these people are animals. He truly, fully believes that to his core, but I also don't want to give him the benefit of the doubt, because I feel like there were people that were in the same upbringing to him that didn't think that. Like Tigress, his cousin, obviously did not feel the same, and she was brought up in a very similar way that he was. So he gets no excuses from me. Another thing that I want to mention when talking about the animal comparisons is a critique of this book that I saw in some reviews online, that the characters were a little flat and there wasn't as much character development as there was in the Hunger Games trilogy. And I feel like that's a valid critique of a book, but that it was intentional with this book because we're seeing it from Snow's eyes and he doesn't view the tributes as people. That seemed really intentional to me. It was not super obvious, the religious commentary, but Sejanus put breadcrumbs on bodies of people that had passed away, and Snow looked at him and was like, what are you doing? Sejanus says, I'm giving them food for their journey, and Snow's like, their journey to where? And Sejanus is like, the afterlife, and Snow's like, oh, okay. And in his head, he's like, these primitive people with their primitive customs. And I thought that was a really interesting take on religion, and I feel like there could be a lot to unpack there. The way that Suzanne Collins illustrated power and chaos and control with part 3 of the book called The Peacekeeper, there were a lot of very obvious, I don't know if you can hear that siren as I'm talking about military and cults. The Peacekeepers had some culty elements in them, especially when they walk in and the Peacekeepers that were already there kind of welcomed them in and were like, we're brothers now. Day one, never met them, we're brothers now, like we're a family. And that was really culty. So I liked it. I like a nod to a cult in a book because cults are so fun to join. No, I'm just kidding, to think about. It was very fascinating to see that side of Snow's life, and it was interesting to learn what he liked and what he didn't like about being in the Peacekeepers and being in a very structured setting. And we kind of see the people that joined it because they were like, this is a way out of my current circumstances. This is so much better. Like, I'm getting fed, I'm making money. And it's interesting with chaos and control because it's a great place to be until shit's hitting the fan, and the people that joined the Peacekeepers for control will ultimately have to give that up. One of my favorite things that I learned about in school was logical fallacies. I am fascinated with the way that people can put together arguments that don't make sense, and the way that it happens so often in real life. Once I learned about what the logical fallacies were, I did not stop seeing them, and so I love seeing them come up in books. And naturally, the way that Snow thought was very logically not sound, and I think that if I read this again, I'm gonna have a printed list of logical fallacies, and I'm going to annotate all of the ways that he thought that were not sound logic, because logic puzzles and stuff too always were my favorite thing in school, like just so fun. So one of the big ones was slippery slope, where they said we need the Hunger Games to control people because people are evil and they're gonna kill us if they're unchecked. Very slippery slope, classic argument. The bandwagon fallacy was in the same vein to that. A lot of people thought the way that they did. A lot of people were scared of the authority, and so a lot of people were like, oh, well, everyone thinks that, so it has to be true. Not really. Independent thinking is definitely not a good thing in the Capitol, as we know from the Hunger Games trilogy. False dichotomy was one of the biggest ones that I saw, because Snow would say, my options are this or this. And that wasn't true. He was like, I have to do this, and if that doesn't work, then I'll have to do this. And I was reading, I was like, no, you don't have to do that. Like, you don't have to rat your friend out to the authorities and ultimately get him hanged. You do not have to do that. Like, that is not your responsibility. There are other options. And he just truly would be like, I can do these two things. And it was so insane to hear his thoughts on things like that. Begging the questions / circular reasoning, where we see this when people are like, oh, the Bible's true because the Bible says it's true. I'm not saying that it's not true, but that is not a sound argument because it's circular. And that was kind of how Snow's thought patterns were. Like, he was like, well, this is true because of this. And you're reading it and you're like, no, that's not true. Like, that's not true. You're not thinking about things right. You just want to knock some sense into him, but you can't, because he's been so conditioned to believe certain things, and he has a lack of empathy. And I think that ultimately the combination of his indoctrination and his lack of empathy that probably maybe he was born with, I don't know how that works, made him the cold-hearted villain that we know and love to hate. Another thing that Suzanne Collins does so well is foils. There were so many foils in the Hunger Games. A foil is basically a character who contrasts with another character. So think about Gale and Peeta as foils, or Katniss and Snow as foils, or Lucy Gray and Snow as foils. So when I was thinking about the foils that I really loved and the way that Suzanne Collins will develop another character through a character that's opposite, we saw that a lot in the Hunger Games, the first book of the series, with Peeta and Katniss, and how they were so different in so many ways, but they did have a lot of similar compassion for other people. But we got to see how reckless Katniss was by learning more about how calm and collected Peeta was. And Snow definitely contrasts with Katniss a lot, and I thought about them a lot as really good literary foils. And then I think that Snow hated Katniss and Peeta so much and hated their relationship so much because they seemed to have so much of a purer love than he probably ever experienced in his life. Thinking about Katniss and Peeta through Snow's eyes and how he probably perceived them as so fake. He thought that their love was just a facade for viewers. I think that their romantic love was definitely a facade, and they did what they had to do to survive, but there was a lot of real compassion and love between them, even if not romantic. And I don't think Snow knows what that is, so I think to him it looked extremely fake, and it probably rubbed him the wrong way because he never felt that. And again, I'm not making excuses for him. I'm not saying he's a good person for that, but I think that that was where a lot of the hate probably came from. Snow versus Sejanus, we got to see how Sejanus wanted freedom so bad. He came from District 2, so he was district and Snow was capital, and he wanted freedom so bad and to go back to the district. And Snow wanted control so bad, even if he got no freedom. And they were perfect together for that reason, because they just were on such different wavelengths with the way that they thought about things. And I think that Sejanus's character was flawlessly executed and showed Snow in the light that he was meant to be shown in, which is a bad person versus a good person. Another foil that I loved was Katniss versus Lucy Gray. I actually don't think that they were foils at all because they were very similar, but there were a lot of parallels between Katniss and Lucy Gray for sure. That was very intentional. I think that Snow wanting to take Lucy Gray's show-stopping entrance and exploit it for more viewers and more support for her was very like Haymitch and Katniss coded, and Peeta too. Like, Peeta and Haymitch were very good at putting Katniss on a pedestal and like using what she did to kind of like, and they would reshape it. And I feel like Snow did a lot of that with Lucy Gray. So that was really interesting. Lucy Gray was very disarming and naturally commanding of a room, and so was Katniss. There were some critiques about Lucy Gray as a character, saying that she fell a little flat. And again, I think this was intentional because we're seeing her through Snow's perspective. So of course, a lot of her nuance is going to be lost on someone that cannot understand poetry and cannot understand empathy, where that was a lot of who she was music and empathy. So a lot of it is just completely lost on Snow. Even though he loves her, he does not understand her. And it's interesting that love to her was trust, and she trusted him, but he was probably the least trustworthy person to ever exist. And then Snow was very calculated and really good with words, just like Peeta was. Peeta obviously was a lovely human being and Snow was not, but they definitely had the same talent for words, and that was cool. The love triangle in the Hunger Games, let's talk about it, because that was a big commentary on love and what it is. Because a lot of people that I heard talking about the Hunger Games, not a lot, I heard one podcast talking about the Hunger Games. Why doesn't she just pick one? Why is she stringing them both along? Because Katniss is battling an oppressive government and she has bigger problems than which boy she likes. And she's a kid. She's literally a teenager. So Katniss was very ahead of her time in the fact that she was truly wanted to decenter men from her life. And you could see her battle a lot with not wanting to hurt them, but not wanting to pursue a romantic relationship, which is extremely valid because she was very busy. She was constantly passing the Bechdel test. Men were not on her mind, but she was living rent-free in Peeta and Gale's. And I could talk about Peeta and Gale freaking forever because it's just ridiculous that, well, I guess not ridiculous, but again, like there was a lot of love between Katniss and Gale and a lot of love between Katniss and Peeta, not necessarily romantic. And I think that that's an amazing thing to put into a young adult novel. Love that doesn't necessarily have to be romantic. The man's point of view made it so much more obvious. Hearing Snow say, I wonder if she's thinking of me, when she's literally in the Hunger Games fighting for her life. She's not thinking about you. She's thinking about not dying. And just his thick skull was crazy to see. So it was very interesting to hear that from him. And the love triangle in the Hunger Games was, I mean, it was flawless, but I think a lot of people missed the point. Maybe everyone got it. Final thing that I want to talk about is something that I mentioned a little bit earlier, the American Psycho of it all, and how this book reminded me of American Psycho because we're hearing about the world through the perspective of a man that has no empathy, and it's jarring at times to read on purpose. I especially noticed it when Snow was talking about the death of one of his classmates, and he's like, yeah, I feel so bad, I feel so sad. He's putting on that facade, and in his head, he's literally like, she was so annoying and that brought on her death. And just to hear that in such a matter-of-fact way really reminded me of Patrick Bateman. I don't know if, Suzanne Collins liked American Psycho, but if I meet her, I will ask her. That would be such an incredible conversation to talk to her about the books that she likes. And then the way that he's more rattled by the aesthetics of death than death itself also reminded me of Patrick Bateman. And then Frankenstein. As soon as we get to the part where we learn that Dr. Gall is behind it all, and when he's like, am I in trouble? And she's like, no, I wasn't gonna waste all that time. Like, she knew that she created the perfect monster to play out her purposes. And I immediately was like, Frankenstein. Have I read Frankenstein? I don't think so, but I know the gist of it. And the making of a monster was crazy because you can tell that she did it on purpose, but also he was just already a bad person. So it was easy to make him and shape him into this perfect villain. And Dr. Gall was behind it all. That rhymes. I did notice that nod to Frankenstein immediately as soon as we get to that point in the book. I guess as soon as we get to the point where it's the very end of the book and they're talking and she's like, you're gonna study under me. She's like, I haven't invested all this time in you to go to the districts. Dr. Gall is a monster and she created a monster. And then after I finished the book and went back to the front, when I started this book, in the front page, there's 5 quotes, and I was like, okay, interesting. 3 quotes from philosophers who are credited, I think, largely with the idea of nature versus nurture and the social contract. Are people born good or evil? I think. I'm not 100% sure. I did not do my research on that. There's a quote by Mary Shelley from Frankenstein. at the very bottom. And I was like, Suzanne Collins, you're a genius. You did it on purpose. And I loved it. And it kind of makes me want to read Frankenstein. Maybe that'll be a 2023 read because it was a really perfect end to the book. The thing that solidified how bad of a person Snow was are two things. How fast he turned on Lucy Gray and was ready to kill her towards the end of the book. This woman that he loved, who he thought he was gonna lose, and she survived the Hunger Games. And then he ends up just being ready to kill her at the drop of a hat. That was crazy. And then him choosing to just ditch her and ditch their plans because he cared more about power and prestige and going to school and being the peace, like, I was like expecting, okay, when I was on chapter 28, so that's like probably 90% of the way through. I was like, shit's gonna hit the fan. I can feel it. It's brewing. Like the tragic ending has to happen. I thought that Lucy Gray was gonna die at the end, and boy was I wrong. And I'm so glad that I was wrong because it made it so much more. We got a tragic death that Snow ultimately caused. He caused his closest friend, that I'm sure he felt no love for at all, die because of him and his actions and his stupidity. And then he just chose to ditch Lucy Gray. And I was like, oh my gosh. But it had to end like that, just like Prim had to die. In Mockingjay, Suzanne Collins will kill someone to drive the point home, and I respect her for that because it's a work of fiction. Random thought, even though I'm 53 minutes into the raw footage, and that's so much editing, when they were in the shed talking about the escape plan, when Snow kind of walked in and crashed it, it reminded me of this scene from The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker where you're in the bomb shack and you're overhearing this conversation and you're sneaking and then they catch you. Like, it literally, that's what I pictured, and if that's not how the scene looks in the movie, I'm gonna be so sad. I also have a very vivid picture in my mind of how that Hunger Games arena looks, so it's gonna be extremely interesting to see how it looks on the screen. I have not been this excited for a book to screen adaptation in a long time. I am so freaking happy I read this book after seeing mixed reviews. This was the easiest 5 stars I gave all year. To close it out, some thoughts on reading and the reviews for this book, because there's tons of reasons why you might not like a book, and it's so valid to not finish a book. I think it's kind of stupid to force yourself to read something that you're not enjoying. Like, why are you going to do that? But literally, reading is something that you're supposed to it's personal to you, and I don't think that we should hate on other people for what they like to read and why they like to read it, because people read for very different reasons, and it's just not good to yuck people's yums. But what I noticed when reading the critiques for this book was that a lot of them were very similar. The 1-star review would be similar to the 5-star review in terms of content. They were just like, people were like, I did, like, it was this and this, so I didn't like it. And then the 5-star review, it was the same thing, and I loved it. And I felt like that just really, you wrote a really great book when the reasons for people not liking it are the same as the reasons that people liked it, because, like, wow, you got your point across, I feel. So if you read it or if you see the movie, I would love to hear your thoughts about some of the themes. I know that I didn't give a lot of background on plot or characters. It was literally just themes from the book, but I'm very excited to watch the movie, and hopefully some of the things that made The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes really cool are done well in the movie. I have a lot of hope for it because obviously the original trilogy books and movies were all incredible. I'm so curious to hear what you noticed about The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and why you liked or disliked it, and what you agree with or disagree with, because I am in no way an English literature buff. I just like to read. Some of my opinions are probably wrong. Some of my thoughts are probably wrong, and if you think they are, I would love to hear about it, and I would love to hear what you thought of the book, and if you're going to see the movie, if you like it. So please like and subscribe. This was so fun. I'm so freaking excited, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day full of reading whatever you want to read. Bye.